What happens when a bloodline, believed to be chosen by God, is cursed by its own blood? We see them in portraits, immortalized in oil and canvas: monarchs, emperors, pharaohs, figures of absolute power. Their lineage a supposedly unbroken chain of strength and divine right. We are taught to see them as symbols of perfection, the physical embodiment of their nation's glory. But what if this image is a meticulously crafted lie? What if, behind the heavy oak doors of the royal nursery and the drawn curtains of the king's private chambers, a terrifying secret was being hidden from the world, a secret whispered by physicians and silenced by decree? This is the story of the cracks in the porcelain facade of royalty, the story of heirs born with bodies and minds that defied every expectation of perfection. Tonight, we will pull back the velvet curtain to expose the shocking truth about the monarchs born with disabilities, a truth of pain, concealment, and consequence that has the power to shatter our entire perception of the crown. To understand this story, we must first travel back in time, to an era when kings were not merely rulers, they were gods. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was Horus in the flesh, a divine vessel whose physical perfection was a reflection of the cosmic order itself. To preserve this sacred status, the royal bloodline had to be kept pure, untainted by the blood of commoners. This belief led to a practice that seems shocking to us today, but was a holy imperative to them: incest. Brother married sister, and father married daughter, for generations, in a relentless effort to maintain the divinity of their lineage. They believed they were protecting their power, but they were unwittingly planting the seeds of their own physical decay. For centuries, this was a reality hidden by time and hieroglyphs. Then, in 1922, the world was electrified by the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. The boy king became an icon of splendor and mystery. His golden death mask presented an image of serene, symmetrical perfection. He was the embodiment of Egyptian glory, a god king frozen in eternal youth. For decades, this was the only truth we knew. But in the 21st century, technology gave us the power to see through the gold and past the myth. Through a series of CT scans and DNA analysis, scientists uncovered the tragic reality of the boy behind the mask. Tutankhamun was far from the perfect figure he was portrayed to be. He was born with a multitude of debilitating conditions. The direct result of his parents being brother and sister, he had a severe clubfoot, forcing him to walk with a cane over, 130 of which were found in his tomb, not as symbols of power, but as necessities for mobility. He suffered from collar disease, a rare and painful bone disorder in his foot. Genetic analysis also revealed he had a cleft palate and scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. The supreme ruler of the most powerful empire on earth was, in reality, a frail young man who likely lived in constant pain. The very act designed to ensure his divinity, the purity of his blood, had left him physically broken. He was the living paradox of his culture, a god trapped in a fragile human body, weakened by the very traditions meant to make him strong. Tutankhamun's story is a chilling prelude, a first glimpse into a pattern that would repeat itself across history. But as we will soon see, the consequences of this obsession with blood purity in other empires would become infinitely more extreme, and far more terrifying. As we move from the sands of Egypt to the gilded courts of Europe, the story darkens. If the Egyptians practiced inbreeding to preserve divinity, the House of Habsburg perfected it to hoard power. For over 3 centuries, this single family dominated Europe. They controlled a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to the Americas. Their motto was Bella Geranta Li, to Felix Austria Nubi. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria marry. Their strategy was to conquer not with armies, but with marriage vows. Uncle married niece, and first cousins wed, weaving a complex web of alliances that kept crowns, titles, and territories firmly within the family. But this web of power became a genetic prison. The very blood they sought to ennoble became their most fearsome enemy. This is where we encounter the infamous Habsburg Jaw. It began subtly, a prominent lower jaw, a slightly protruding chin. But as generations of inbreeding compounded the genetic flaws, this feature became a grotesque deformity. The jaw, known medically as grew so pronounced that it prevented rulers from closing their mouths properly. Imagine a king on his throne, unable to eat without immense difficulty, his speech slurred by a tongue too large for his misshapen mouth, a constant stream of drool escaping his lips. This was the reality for rulers like Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. His jaw was so large and his teeth so misaligned that his effigy on coins had to be softened to avoid alarming the public. But the jaw was just the most visible sign of a body collapsing from within. We must look at the tragic figure of Philip IV of Spain. His portraits, painted by the masters, show a long, mournful face, the embodiment of the Habsburg jaw. But inside, his body was a catalogue of hereditary ailments. He was epileptic, prone to seizures that would leave him weak and disoriented for days. He was impotent for long periods and suffered from what was likely a litany of metabolic disorders. He was a king in constant, debilitating pain, presiding over the slow decline of his empire, a decline mirrored in the decay of his own body. This was a horror that unfolded in plain sight, yet was never truly acknowledged. Court physicians would invent elaborate deferential diagnoses, blaming the climate, melancholic humors, or divine tests for what was clearly a self-inflicted curse. The Habsburgs became a dynasty of living ghosts. Their palaces filled with the echoes of rasping breaths, the sight of limping gates, and the palpable tension of waiting for the next heir to be born, praying they would be spared the family's inexorable, terrifying legacy. They were trapped, their ambition for absolute power leading them down a path of absolute genetic ruin. And it was all leading to one final, catastrophic conclusion. Everything we have discussed, the divine right of the pharaoh, the political marriages of the Habsburgs, all of it leads to one person, a single human being who would become the final, agonizing punctuation mark at the end of his dynastic sentence. He was Charles II of Spain, known to history by a name that speaks volumes. El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He was not just a king born with disabilities. He was a man whose very existence was a catalogue of human suffering, the living embodiment of centuries of genetic decay. He was the product of a family tree so insular it had collapsed in on itself. His father was the uncle of his mother. His grandmother was also his aunt. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. He was born physically weak, his body so misshapen and fragile that he was not expected to survive infancy. He couldn't walk until the age of 8. He could not speak properly until he was 4. He was treated as a perpetual toddler, rarely educated, and allowed to indulge in every whim, a king in name but an infant in practice. As he grew, the full horror of the Habsburg legacy became manifest. Foreign ambassadors sent shocking reports back to their home courts. They described a man with a grotesquely large head that lolled on a weak neck, a body so frail he would often fall. His Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he could barely chew his food, which had to be swallowed whole, leading to constant indigestion and illness. His tongue was so large that his speech was often an unintelligible mumble. He was epileptic, impotent, and by all accounts, suffered from severe intellectual and developmental disabilities. This was the man who ruled the mighty Spanish Empire. The Spanish court, steeped in religious fervor and superstition, could not comprehend the biological reality before them. They concluded that such a calamitous state could only be the result of witchcraft. For years, the King of Spain was subjected to terrifying exorcisms. Priests and inquisitors surrounded him, chanting prayers and performing rituals to cast out the demons they believed were residing in his broken body, a profound cruelty born of profound ignorance. But the most shocking truth of all would not be revealed until after his death at the tragically young age of 38. The physician who performed the autopsy wrote a report that is perhaps one of the most horrifying documents in medical history. He found that the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded, his intestines gangrenous, his head, the report states, was full of water. And in a final, damning testament to the genetic wasteland of his lineage, he was found to possess only a single, black, and atrophied testicle. He died without an heir, because he was biologically incapable of producing one. With his last, gasping breath, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful in human history, ended. His death immediately triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal continent-spanning conflict that lasted over a decade and reshaped the map of Europe forever. It was the ultimate, devastating conclusion. The quest for blood purity had not only destroyed a man, it had annihilated a dynasty and plunged a continent into war. So, what is the shocking truth about monarchs born with disabilities? The truth is not simply that they existed. It is that their suffering was almost never a random act of fate or a curse from God. It was a direct, predictable, and horrific consequence of the very systems of power they were born to embody. Their broken bodies were the final ledger, the terrible accounting of an ideology obsessed with its own purity. The tragedy was not that these royal bloodlines were impure, but that their relentless pursuit of that impossible ideal, through generations of incest, created the very weaknesses they sought to avoid. It was a man-made catastrophe, hidden behind a wall of divine right and absolute authority. These stories, once shrouded in superstition and shame, are today illuminated by science. We no longer see the work of demons in Charles II. We see the clear genetic markers of mandibular prognathism, the brutal endpoint of inbreeding. We no longer need to guess about the boy King Tutankhamun. We can read his story in his DNA, a story of congenital conditions passed from his brother-sister parents. Science has given us the language to describe their suffering, transforming them from bewitched figures of folklore into tragic case studies in human genetics. They are a timeless and brutal lesson on the fact that biology does not respect crowns or titles, and perhaps this is their most enduring legacy. These monarchs, who were once the most powerful people on the planet, now serve as a permanent warning. They teach us about the profound dangers of placing any ideology, be it of blood purity, racial supremacy, or divine right above basic human reality. Their stories have been unearthed from the footnotes of history and the silence of the tomb, and they demand to be heard. They force us to ask a difficult and timeless question, one that echoes from the halls of Versailles to the chambers of the pyramids. In the relentless pursuit of power, how many other human truths have been hidden, silenced, or sacrificed to protect a gilded and perfect lie?